and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Rhona Brown to hear all about the project to collect the works of Robert Fergusson. Hello, Rhona.
Hi, Ali. How are you?
I'm really well. So the first question, I've got a feeling I could probably sit back and relax for about 15 minutes while you give the answer to this. But
Well,
first of all, can you give an overview as to who Robert Fergusson was and why this is an important project?
yeah, okay. I could go on about this for a very long time, as you say. Robert Fergusson is an 18th century Scottish poet. He is really very much associated with Edinburgh. A lot of his work has Edinburgh almost as a character in itself. It's quite often the backdrop of his work. Ferguson's poetry really focuses on everyday life in Edinburgh. It uses the voices and the language of the ordinary working people of Edinburgh, and it commemorates their day-to-day dramas and events and just general life on the streets of Aldreekie, as he refers to it. So that's the work, which was hugely influential on later poets, including Burns, as we'll probably talk about separately. But the thing about Fergusson that most people will know or will have some knowledge of is his really tragic life story. Fergusson unfortunately died at the age of 24 in really quite appalling conditions in an asylum. He'd spent the last couple of months of his life essentially incarcerated in Edinburgh's Asylum for Pauper Lunatics, which was referred to locally as Bedlam after the infamous London Asylum. So there is obviously great tragedy in Ferguson's life, but what we're trying to do as part of the project is emphasise the real triumph and achievement of Ferguson's life, because he had a very short creative life within that really short life of really only about 3-4 years, and he published over 100 poems in that time, poems, songs. We worked out that about 80% of them were published in his lifetime.
Right.
So that kind of achievement is sometimes not seen very clearly in that tragic story. But the reason we're focusing on Ferguson so heavily just now, not just because he was my first research love and I really love working on Ferguson, but it's also because this is the 250th anniversary of his death on the 17th of October. So very shortly, just past essentially the 250th anniversary.
So, I mean, you've said it there, but for those who are not great with maths, what kind of time are we talking about? What's the kind of time of his life, his short life?
Yeah, so he's born in Edinburgh in 1750 and he dies in 1774, just a month after his 24th birthday, sorry. So he's born September, dies in October. So it is a very short life. But in terms of timelines, if you know your Scottish poetry of the 18th century, he is influenced by Allan Ramsay really very deeply, and he then goes on to influence Burns very deeply in the 1780s. So he's the kind of awkward middle child in that trio of Scottish poets, with the saddest life of all three of them and the shortest life of all three of them.
And you said how he was central to Edinburgh. People have perhaps probably walked by his statue and not realised that that's where he is. Whereabouts is that?
It's a really gorgeous statue.
Yes.
Walking along the pavement outside the Canongate Kirk on the High Street in Edinburgh, as you go down across from the Museum of Childhood, as you go down towards Holyrood. And we had an event actually earlier in the year with the sculptor of the statue, David Dannand. It was unveiled in 2004, which was an anniversary of his death. I can't count that one, but it was an anniversary. And David Dannand said he doesn't like it to be called a statue, which I thought was really interesting. He likes it to be called a sculpture because it's not on a plinth, and it was very deliberately not on a plinth, because Ferguson's poetry is all about life in the city, and he's part of that city. Annand wanted him to be on the street, as it were, among the people he wrote about. So it's a really gorgeous statue. So next time you pass him, you will know it's Robert Fergusson.
And I think that's a really probably just distinction, because it's a piece of sculpture which is actually full of life. You feel like he's jauntily he's making his way up to the Royal
That's
Mile
right.
as much as you might be as well.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And he's got a book in his hand. He's looking very purposefully down towards Holyrood, maybe a bit ironically, considering his politics, but we'll maybe come back to that later. So it really is. Yeah, it's as close as you can get to a living statue, if I can put it in that way.
And you mentioned that he was published during his lifetime. Was he celebrated during his lifetime?
He was. We don't know how much, unfortunately. But the thing about Ferguson that's different from other writers like Ramsay and Burns, for example, is that he didn't rely on patronage. So in the 18th century, the patronage system was the most common way to get your work published. And that essentially meant you had to identify usually an aristocratic, but definitely a wealthy patron who would support you, subscribe to your works, help advertise your works, etc., etc. Help develop your career. But Ferguson doesn't do that, and I don't know whether he chooses not to do it or whether it doesn't come to him. But he becomes a periodicals poet, so he publishes the vast majority of his work in magazines, particularly the Weekly Magazine or Edinburgh Amusement, and that is where his work appears on an almost weekly basis between the 1771 and his final illness at the end of 73. He also writes songs for operas, so he's known as a poet, as a songwriter, and as part of the kind of world of theatre in Edinburgh in the 1770s, I think. So he also published a collection of poems in 1773 and individual poems. So there was a lot of publication, and he was referred to in his own lifetime. There were quite a lot of poetic tributes to him within his own lifetime and after, obviously, where he's described as the unofficial laureate of Edinburgh, the laureate of our city. So there's clearly an understanding that he stands for Edinburgh. How famous he was is quite hard for us to tell now, because there's no real record of it like there is for Burns, for example.
And you spoke about the tragic nature of his death, or the circumstances of his death.
Yeah.
Was he ever, what was his kind of situation culturally during that time? You know, was he lauded or looked after, or was it always kind of a case of being below the poverty line?
I think, well, the interesting thing about Ferguson is his family is quite comfortable
Right.
before they come to Edinburgh. So he comes from, his parents come from the northeast, from Aberdeenshire,
Right.
and they are both of landed families. But when they come to Edinburgh, Ferguson's father, William, had to become self-sufficient. He had to get employment, and he had to support a family. There were 5 children, only 4 of them survived. So quite a big family to support. And so the circumstances were always quite narrow. And Ferguson went to university, but he only did that through a bursary.
Right.
So at the time of his illness, at that time, as your listeners and you know, there was no NHS. If you needed therapeutic treatment, you had to pay for it. And Ferguson just wasn't in a position to do that, because we should remember that alongside his poetry, he kept up a day-to-day job as a legal clerk. So he never was able to be a writer for a living. He always had to support himself in other ways. But while he was incarcerated, he was treated by a very influential doctor that had very far-reaching effects after Ferguson's death. And we can come back to that if you like. The Cape Club, of which he was a member, gathered money together for him. There was an attempt to get him a job in the colonies, but that just came just slightly after his death. So that various people involved themselves in Ferguson's life, but sadly, the circumstances were such there was no way he could be treated or saved in that period. There was just no treatment for brain injury in that period, which is the reason for his death.
And that was what it was. It was due to brain injury rather than ill health in any other way.
Well, he was never a well man by all accounts. And he often had ill mental health as well, or mental ill health. But the final catastrophe came about basically because he fell down a flight of stone steps and hit his head. And after that point, he was deemed, biographers describe him as furiously insane. So there was kind of violence involved alongside the irrationality. And so that was why he had to be removed to the asylum, because he couldn't be, his mother was old, she couldn't look after him, they didn't have a lot of money, so they couldn't get him into better care. So that is the circumstance. And the brain injury was what killed him over a period of weeks. It seems to have been a slow bleed in the brain after that initial injury.
So it might be nice to put him in other kind of cultural context at the time. What else was going on in Edinburgh at that time? Who maybe was around in the scene? You know, you've mentioned him being a kind of link between Ramsay and Burns, but what else was going on in that time in 18th century Edinburgh?
Well, this is the time Allan Ramsay really creates a very strong foundation for Scottish cultural enterprise to really flourish in Ferguson's period. So Ramsay is working in the early part of the 18th century. He does all the things that Burns would go on to do and that Ferguson does in his shorter kind of time frame. So he writes poetry in the Scots language. He collects Scottish songs. He collects older specimens of Scottish poetry. He collects proverbs. He becomes almost like a gatekeeper of Scottish culture in the first half of the century. That is hugely influential in Ferguson, who takes, a lot of people say he takes on the mantle of Ramsay, but I don't really like that apostolic kind of language. It doesn't let you see these writers in their own right. But certainly the work that Ramsay did in Scots gave Ferguson a model that would work for him. So in the period of the 1770s, he's a member of the Cape Club. The Cape Club is attended by quite a lot of writers, musicians, artists, actors, playwrights, and this is where he gets his kind of cultural world, I think, really. So amongst his best friends are the song collector and editor David Heard, the artist Alexander Runciman, and Rayburn would join the Cape Club later on, but after Ferguson's death. He's also in the Cape Club with really renowned Edinburgh publishers Martin and Witherspoon, and alongside quite prominent antiquarians at the time who were involved in the establishment of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, like James Cumming. So he's moving in interesting cultural circles. He's a big theatre goer. He's pally with all the actors. He is not involved directly, but goes along to all the musical society events. So he's really immersed in what is happening culturally in Edinburgh. He's involved in everything, essentially.
And is that what he reacts to in his poetry, or is it much wider than that?
I think he does react to that, but it is wider. So I think in Ferguson, what we see is an intense preoccupation with the local, especially with what's happening in Edinburgh on a day-to-day basis, which is astute and funny, but also quite satirical and sharply satirical sometimes, because he really has no time for pretension and vanity, and he will put a pin in that bubble every opportunity he can get. And hypocrisy is another kind of favourite. But he also has influence from the English Augustan writers like Alexander Pope and Dryden and Steele, who look for more universal, we can't really use these terms today, but universal in that sense, human truths. So the local is important, Edinburgh is super important, but he's got interests way, way beyond that. And he does write countryside pastoral poetry as well as city poetry. And he does also write in Scots as well as English. And we sometimes forget, we focus on the Scots work that's based in the city, but there's all this other stuff and a much wider linguistic register than maybe he's given credit for.
And is it worthwhile thinking of what Edinburgh was like at that time, because obviously it would be smaller than it is now. You've got
Yeah.
the central bit that we tourists and visitors
Yeah.
know so well, because the country then would be not that far.
No, it wouldn't. It would be quite easy to get to the countryside. So he talks about Haddington, he talks about Leith being in the countryside
Yeah.
essentially. Um, Edinburgh in Ferguson's time was in a period of change and transition, because this was the time when the new town was beginning to be built. So Ferguson was born in a street called Cap and Feather Close. I always love that name. And it was round about St Mary's Street, just above the North Bridge, but it was demolished to make way for the North Bridge itself.
All right.
And so they moved to Warriston Close later, his family. But Edinburgh for Ferguson is the old town, as we would understand it today. And even that very small bit of the old town that surrounds the Cannon Gate, the Cow Gate, the High Street, that area of Edinburgh, really cramped, with some slum-like conditions, quite a poor place, quite a smelly place by all accounts, because the tenement dwellers would have to throw their waste out of the windows, shouting "Gardy Lou" to the
Yeah.
folk passing by. So yeah, chaotic, busy, grimy, old. I think that's how we would describe
And
it.
in a small space, I'm imagining you see real poverty, but also the kind of some of the top people in the country in terms of where they might be and
Yeah.
where they might be, going to their daily job of work or whatever.
That's right. That's right. So this is, of course, the period of kind of following and of enlightenment in Edinburgh. So this is the period where we have Adam Smith and David Hume and the great Athens of the North flourishing of Scottish philosophy. There's an argument that Ferguson wasn't part of that, but I think that the Enlightenment helps Ferguson be the kind of poet he wants to be. It's another enabler for him. So he might not have been in the elite literati, but I think that's probably how he would have preferred it, to be honest.
Yeah. And I guess, going back to what you said initially, a young man at the time as well.
A young man, yeah. So just to put in perspective, his first publications are, as I mentioned earlier, lyrics for operas that were performed in Edinburgh's Theatre Royal. He publishes these when he's in 1769, so he's either 18 or 19 when he publishes his first and his first songs. And if we think about these songs performed on the stage, that must have felt like a huge thing for a 19-year-old.
All right.
And the vast majority of his works published between the ages of 21 and 23. So yeah, extremely young, but hugely, almost like a prodigy.
And you mentioned before the fact that he's so close to the modern day parliament and what were his politics and what were the influences on them?
Ferguson's politics are a wee bit hard to pin down, but there's loads of evidence that he was a supporter of the Jacobites. So that means he was a supporter of the Stuarts as the rightful monarchs of Scotland. The threat of Jacobitism was very real in Ramsay's time, but it had subsided a bit in Ferguson, so it was a wee bit safer for Ferguson to express these things. He was an 18th century Tory, which is very different from our idea of Toryism today, but essentially had a belief in certain structures and certain modes which links to his Jacobitism, I think. He was not the hugest fan of the Union of 1707. In a poem called The Guests, he really bemoans some of the things that have come about since the Union. So The Guests is a poem which is really about a contemporary piece of legislation. I mean, it sounds really boring, but it's one of Ferguson's really most politically barbed poems. So there's this new piece of legislation that wants charitable funds to be put in a British pool. So all charities across Britain, all the money to go into one pool, and the charities themselves were to get a paltry interest rate of 3%. And there was a huge outcry about this, not least because people were worried about Scottish charitable funds being handled in London. They were worried about that rubbish interest rate. They were worried that it would put off endowments and benefactors. So there was a huge stricture about this in Edinburgh and beyond, all through Scotland at the time. So Ferguson's poem, The Guests, brings this conversation to life through two dead people. That sounds like a real contradiction. But he brings two renowned Edinburgh benefactors back to life as ghosts, and they discuss this situation. And the ghosts are George Heriot and George Watson, who were the benefactors of Heriot's school and Watson's school, which still exists today in Edinburgh. So what they basically say is, this would never have happened in the time of King James, the Stuart monarch. This is a situation where you've got the elites yoking hard the poor and letting the rich churls be pampered at ease by others' industry, as he puts it. It's very forthright. But there's one line spoken by Heriot that says, "Black be the day that ere to England's ground Scotland was eked by the Union's bond." Eked means added, essentially. So it's a black day when Scotland and England came together in the Union. And this is a line that a lot of people really seize on as evidence of Ferguson's anti-unionism. It's definitely an anti-unionist sentiment, but it's not spoken by Ferguson, it's spoken by a ghost. So there's a bit of distancing goes on, which is probably him just hedging his bets a bit. But the politics, I think, if we look, are Jacobite, Tory, proto-nationalist, because there's no nationalism in the 18th century as we would recognise it.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, which I know I spoke to a writer just recently who has done the same thing in his novel, just that distancing, saying, that's not me saying
No me.
it. That's
It's not me.
And so what was the influence on Burns then, the kind of third of, you say, of these three poets that had such an influence?
The Holy Triumvirate, I like to call them. The influence in Burns was profound, and Burns professes it really openly, that without Ferguson, I don't think we would have Burns. I think it is that profound. The evidence we have is in, there are literary tributes, but there are also concrete tributes. So Burns writes in a letter to John Moore in August 1787. So this is after the publication of the Kilmarnock edition, which brought him to initial fame, and at the time when he's in Edinburgh for the first time and he's being lionised by the literati. So this letter is an autobiographical letter. He basically tells his story to Moore in this letter. And in that letter, Burns says, I'm quoting from memory, so sorry if it's wrong. "Rhyme, except some religious pieces which are in print, I had given up, but meeting with Ferguson's Scotch poems, I strung anew my wildly sounding rustic lyre with emulating vigour." So he'd given up on poetry. This is a time when he was pretty depressed. He was in Irvine. He was trying to learn flax dressing. Bad time in Burns's life. But he suddenly reads Ferguson and his world is transformed. Ferguson gives him an example to emulate, as he puts it, to follow. He writes about Ferguson in a few poems, referring to him as my elder brother in misfortune, by far my elder brother in the Muses. And he's really, I suppose, one of Ferguson's first unofficial biographers, because he tells Ferguson's story in a few places. But what people might be aware of is that Burns erected Ferguson's headstone. So the headstone that is in the Canongate Kirkyard now, where the statue is that we've just mentioned, Burns went in 1787 to pay pilgrimage to Ferguson's grave, and he found the grave unmarked, and he was really upset by this. And so he went about immediately trying to right the wrong. So he got a stonemason. He wrote all the inscription for the stone, which is still there today. and it took him about 4 or 5 years to pay it off. It seemed to have been quite expensive. So on the inscription, he refers to Ferguson as Scotia's poet, the poet of Scotland, essentially. So he pays tribute through literary memorial, but also through an actual memorial, a concrete memorial, and numerous Burns poems are based on Ferguson originals. There's a huge list. The Holy Fair is based on Leith Races and the Daft Days. The Cota Saturday Night is based on the Farmer's Ingle. The Twadugs and the Briggs of Ayr are based on Plainstanes and Causey. I could go on. There are lots and lots of examples. So that word emulation, I think he kind of took to heart, but it was Ferguson the poet in Scots, that inspired Burns, not that other bit of Ferguson quite so much.
So I'm just, to get that kind of clear in my head, he read Ferguson when he was in Irvine.
I think so. That's what we think.
So that says a lot. I mean, maybe says a lot about how Burns in particular, but wider, that poetry that was being made in Edinburgh at the time had that far reach.
It did. Ferguson published one volume of poems in his lifetime, imaginatively titled Poems, published by Walter Ruddiman, who was also the publisher of the weekly magazine. But there were posthumous editions where Ruddiman brought together some of the poet's papers after he had died. So there was an edition in 1779. So, and that was seen to be part 2 of the part 1 that Ferguson published in 73. So by 1779, we had as full a canon of, there's more now obviously, but as full a canon of poetry that they thought he had at that time. So then Burns reading this in 1781-82, it has that reach, as you say.
That's amazing. And what attracted you to Ferguson? It was your PhD thesis, is that right?
It was. So, gosh, it's actually 20 years just last month since I finished my PhD. So it feels like a nice kind of circle back to Ferguson at this point. So yeah, what attracted me? So I just really loved the poetry. It was so full of life and like really vivacious, rambunctious life. And I just love his satires because he is so he's smart as a whip. He is razor sharp in his wit, and he is just so a wee bit like Burns, but Ferguson is a wee bit more kind of sharp than Burns, I think, where he'll just, any type of pretension or vanity he can see in the world, he just exposes it for what it is. There's something where Burns can be sentimental. We know that side of Burns that is a bit the mountain daisy and the mouse. That side of Burns, we don't have any of that in Ferguson. He's never sentimental for sentimentality's sake, and I quite like that about him. But it also partly came from Burns because I grew up in Ayrshire. Burns is a massive figure where I grew up, and I was a bit rebellious about Burns for a while, and I thought, why is it always him that I hear about? And so when I went to university, I started hearing about all these other poets, and what I then became interested in was, how did Burns become Burns? And a big bit of that story is Ferguson.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because perhaps we sometimes think these huge literary figures appear in a vacuum. Of course, they never do. Right. And so to find out, who and what influenced them is really interesting. And part of this project is to collect the works of Ferguson, isn't it? That's going to be published.
Yeah. Yes. So the big reason we have the project is that we are putting together a new textual, a new scholarly edition of Ferguson's work. So that's going to bring together all the poems and songs and edit them in according to 21st century editorial standards. So that is quite exciting. And we're doing some different things from previous editors. So what we're doing is really putting the poetry back in that magazine context, because that's the context for most of the first publications. And a lot of previous, well, all previous editions have used the text from later editions, whereas we want to go back to, right, this is how they first appeared, this is the context they were first in. Obviously, we'll take note of what happens later as well, but what we want to do is have the text from its beginning and then show how it evolves through Ferguson's lifetime. So that is quite different from what's happened before. And plus, there are some poems that have come to light since the last big major editions. So we're able to give the fullest edition, the fullest volume of Ferguson's works that's been possible so far.
I guess that's the nature of literary research. It never ends. It's just
No,
always, you're always finding new things, or,
that's right.
discovering new pieces.
Yeah.
There's been other aspects to the project as well, isn't there? Kind of events and exhibitions and other things like that. Can you talk a bit about those?
Yeah, well, we had initially planned to have about 3 events to commemorate the anniversary of Ferguson's death, but there's something about Ferguson that just strikes a chord with people, whether it's the work or the biography or the connections to Scottish literature and how it developed. I don't know, but there's something that people really respond to in Ferguson. So we've ended up doing quite a lot of collaborative things across the project. One of the first things we did was collaborate with Clan, the Scots language theatre group, and with Martin Travers, the playwright in particular, on a new play about Ferguson called Crown of Straw. And that was premiered in a rehearsed reading, not a full production, in June. And it was really quite special because Kieran Mackenzie, who played Ferguson, really caught something. He played the role in an old tatty leather jacket with kind of punky hair, and he became almost like the James Dean version of Ferguson, which is really, I mean, that's part of the legacy too.
Yeah.
That kind of cut down, vivacious life, cut down primal life. So that was really, really one of the best collaborations I've ever done in my professional life. It was so lovely to work with Martin and the Clan team, and Claire Yule, the creative director. And we hope that will go to some other type of production so that more people can see that at some point, we hope.
I'm
Once
sure
all bit funding.
it's been discussed, but it just sounds like the perfect for an Edinburgh run.
Yeah, it would be. And I think everybody should see this play, not just Ferguson fans, but it's got such a lovely message, and it's really informed by the research that we're doing. So it was very special. The other big collaboration we've done is with the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, where we have an exhibition running just now that is taken from their poetry collection, their Scottish poetry collection, which is immense and magnificent. So we co-curated the exhibition, myself, the project research assistant, Dr. Amy Wilcoxon, and Special Collections Librarian Claire Thompson. And the exhibition, it's running till the end of October, so folk can still go and see it until the end of the month. But what it does is it tells Ferguson's story through the collection that the Mitchell has. And it focuses on a Glasgow angle because we talk a lot about Edinburgh,
Yeah.
but there were important early Glasgow publications of Ferguson's work, and Edwin Morgan, whose collection the Mitchell Library has, was a massive Ferguson fan. So we've got a few of Morgan's, a few examples from Morgan's Ferguson collection. That's hard to say. Morgan's Ferguson collection, and some of his thoughts about Ferguson as well in the exhibition. So that
Oh, how
was
wonderful.
really nice thing to do. And it's right in the foyer, free
Yeah.
for anybody that's walking through the Mitchell. So have a look before the end of the month.
I was going to say that it's really accessible, even if you're just passing by, you can
Yeah.
pop in and kind of look through it. And I didn't realize the Edwin Morgan connection, so that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I was reading the project website, and on it, there's a statement that Ferguson's textual legacy has been repeatedly adulterated since his death. Can you talk about that? So it's kind of been abused a little bit.
It has a bit, and it's really because there was so much argy-bargy about Ferguson in his early in the early textual record, that there was sometimes editors taking some liberties with his text, so altering things, changing things, not being true to his original presentation. So Ferguson's a great user of the standard Habe verse form, which has to be presented in a certain way. He's a great user of italics for emphasis, and large and small caps, which is very much an 18th century convention. But some later editors have shifted that, and they've also, as I mentioned earlier, looked at later versions of the text that are maybe not quite as accurate as earlier versions of the text. And so there's been a bit of muddying of the waters with Ferguson. So what we're trying to do is get back to these original texts, just so that we can say, right, here's how it was before all of these other people got involved, and get back to what we hope was Ferguson's real intention. It's hard to find that, obviously, and we can never prove it, but we want to get as close to that as we can.
And do you feel, I'm guessing the answer is yes here, that Ferguson is still relevant today?
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, there's something that strikes a chord, whether it's the discussion of mental health, whether it's the tragic circumstances of his death, whether it's the verve, the huge life of his poetry. There's something there that people really respond to. And I think there is an appetite to learn more about the world before Burns, because Burns is an amazing, wonderful poet. He is the National Poet of Scotland for a reason, but he casts a massive shadow. And I think people do want to know, well, actually, there's more to our culture than this, and there's more even in the 18th century to our culture than this. But one of the other things is that I mentioned earlier, Ferguson had very long-standing legacies. And what I mean by that is literary legacies through writers like Burns, like Robert Louis Stevenson, like Robert Garrioch, like Morgan. These people were hugely influenced by Ferguson. But there's a less well-known legacy that still remains in Edinburgh today, and it comes from Ferguson's time in the asylum. So he was treated when he was in the asylum by a doctor called Andrew Duncan. And Duncan was so affected by Ferguson's case, as he puts it, as a man of genius while a pauper lunatic, that Ferguson really becomes a catalyst for Duncan establishing the first humane mental asylum in Edinburgh. So he then works towards, after working with Ferguson, he works towards establishing the Morningside Asylum, which takes in all the inmates of Bedlam 70 years after Ferguson's death. Is that right? It's maybe but yeah, it's about 70 years after Ferguson's death. And so the Morningside Asylum became the Royal Hospital, the Royal Edinburgh Hospital. And in the Royal Edinburgh Hospital is the Robert Fergusson unit, which treats patients recovering from brain injuries. Wow. So there's a real relevance in the poetry, but there's a real relevance in the legacy as well, that really it's with us right now in the 21st century.
So a real kind of practical legacy from his particular circumstance that he found himself in.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if people are interested, having listened to us today, where can they find out more? What's the best place to do that?
Well, Ferguson has, there's one selected poems edition in press at the moment, and that's the edition by James Robertson, the novelist James Robertson, author of And the Land Lay Still, Gideon Mark, etc., etc. Your readers will know James. So he has recently reissued his selected works that first came out in 2000. So that is available. There's a fair selection of Ferguson's poetry on the Scottish Poetry Library website. So if listeners don't know already, Scottish Poetry Library has lots of profiles of writers past and present with some selections of their work, and there's a good page on Ferguson. Folk can also come and have a look at our website, so the Ferguson Project website at Glasgow University, where we've got some resources and some further information. We're building that website all the time, but we've got a really good blog section where various people have written about their experiences with Ferguson, including Matt, who plays Robert Fergusson in the Real Mary King's Close, the tourist destination in the High Street in Edinburgh. And Ferguson is a character among many in the Real Mary King's Close. So Matt has written a blog for us about being Ferguson. So there's quite a lot of stuff there about Ferguson himself, about the project, and also some of these legacies that we've talked about.
And just mentioning a couple of the names that you've mentioned, Edmund Morgan, James Robertson, it seems clear that this is a poet who's still relevant to other writers, still influencing other writers and their work.
I think that's really important. I've called him a poet's poet because certain really prominent Scottish writers have responded to him in a profound way. So we've talked about Burns, but there's another example in Robert Louis Stevenson, who also provides a plaque for Ferguson's grave. So there's a wee plaque at the grave that was put there by Stevenson. And he conjures up this image of the three Robins, and he means himself, Ferguson and Burns. And he feels this connection to Ferguson because they were both brought up in Edinburgh. They both were sickly. They both had mental health issues. And so he feels this connection, but he feels it to such an extent that he writes in a letter to Crab Angus. He says, "I believe Ferguson lives in me." He feels such a connection that he feels he's kind of part of his soul. But other writers like MacDiarmid writes about Ferguson. Robert Garriott, 20th century poet, hugely influenced by Ferguson in the way that he uses Scots and also the way that he represents Edinburgh as well. And he has a few poems on Ferguson. And we should also mention Robert Crawford, another poet academic who's done a lot on Ferguson in his work. So yeah, I think something of a poet's poet, because Robert Crawford puts it that Ferguson's example terrified and inspired Burns. So I think that might be something that continues across the centuries, because he's really inspiring, but his case is also a bit scary for people of a creative bent.
Yeah, absolutely. Lessons. And I guess even if Burns is the centre of your interest, to give context to this kind of helps give context, I think, in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, I think so. And if you like Burns, you'll love Ferguson. I mean, the writing is so similar that if that's the type of poetry you like, you will really enjoy Ferguson as well. So
you'll find
I just say read some more.
Yeah, absolutely. Rhona, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It's such a fascinating project, and with a lot more to come by the sounds of it.
Yes, a lot more. We're only halfway through. So, and the edition is obviously the big thing, but at the moment, we're just so pleased that so many people are interested in remembering Ferguson 250 years later.
Yeah, it's amazing. Rhona, take care, and thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.